In the winter of 1873, a former field medic built something so strange that his neighbors laughed every time they passed his claim. He took a curved metal shell, salvaged from a failed mining operation, and arced it over his log cabin like a turtle's back. The local doctor said it was the dumbest thing he'd seen in 20 years of frontier living. Minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit was coming, and the medic had just wasted 200 pounds of metal that could have been traded for food. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The problem wasn't the cold itself. It was what the cold did to wood. Every cabin in the Fairbanks Valley burned through a cord of spruce every 10 days. And by February, families were tearing down their own fences just to keep the stove lit. The medic had been a battlefield surgeon in the war, patient with broken men and skeptical of accepted methods. He'd spent 2 winters in interior Alaska, watching families run out of firewood by March, watching children sleep in their coats, watching neighbors abandon claims because they couldn't keep a flame alive. He thought there was a better way. Ridicule didn't stop the cold. Then, January showed up. The build started in September, before the first hard freeze. The medic and his helper, a Norwegian carpenter who owed him a favor from a broken leg the year before, dug a trench 2 feet deep around the cabin's perimeter. They filled it with fieldstone pulled from the creek bed, packing clay between the rocks. The trench became a foundation wall that reached 2 feet above ground level, creating a thermal barrier between the frozen earth and the cabin floor. The skeptics showed up on the 3rd day. The doctor was a practical man, trained in Edinburgh, who'd delivered half the babies in the valley and set more broken bones than he could count. He stood at the edge of the claim and watched the medic pack clay between stones. The doctor said stone wouldn't hold heat any better than logs, and the extra work was pointless. The medic said stone holds heat longer than wood and releases it slower. The doctor said the medic was wasting September, and September was the last month you could still hunt before the snow got too deep. The curved metal shell came next. The medic had traded 2 months of medical work to a mining crew for the salvaged Quonset hut panels, long curved sheets of riveted iron, originally meant to cover a supply depot. He and the helper built a wooden frame over the existing cabin roof, arcing it up and out so the metal shell sat 8 inches above the log roof line. They sealed the gap at the eaves with strips of canvas soaked in pine tar. The skeptic came back when they were sealing the eaves. He asked what the air gap was for. The medic said it traps heat rising off the roof and reflects it back down. The doctor said heat rises, it doesn't fall, and trapping it under metal just makes the cabin hotter in summer. The medic said summer wasn't the problem. The doctor walked back to his own claim, shaking his head. Inside, the medic rebuilt the stove corner. He tore out the old sheet iron stove and replaced it with a fieldstone firebox, 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, built directly against the north wall. The firebox had a cast iron door salvaged from a riverboat and a flue that ran up through the ceiling in the metal shell above. He lined the inside of the firebox with fire brick he'd hauled from Fairbanks, paying for it with a winter's worth of medical visits. The helper asked why they were building the firebox so much larger than a normal stove. The medic said a bigger firebox holds more heat in the stone and releases it slower through the night. The helper said it would take more wood to heat that much stone. The medic said it would take more wood at first, but less wood over time. The helper nodded and kept laying stone. By mid-October, the medic added a second layer of log chinking. He pulled out the old moss and clay between the logs and replaced it with a mix of sawdust, clay, and horsehair. Packing it in tight, and smoothing it flush with the inside wall. Then, he nailed thin planks over the chinking on the interior side, creating a double wall with a half-inch air gap. The skeptic visited again in late October. He inspected the interior chinking and asked why the medic was doubling up on work that was already done. The medic said the air gap stops the cold from reaching the inside wall. The doctor said air doesn't stop anything, and the planks were just going to rot from moisture. The medic said the moisture would vent through the roof gap. The doctor said the whole project was a waste of effort, and the medic would be burning just as much wood as everyone else by February. The final addition was the ceiling layer. The medic and the helper nailed a second ceiling of thin planks below the original log beams, leaving a 6-inch gap. They filled the gap with dry sawdust, packing it tight and sealing the edges with canvas strips. The sawdust layer ran from wall to wall, covering the entire ceiling plane. November arrived cold and clear. The medic lit the firebox for the first time on November 4th. He burned a full load of spruce, letting the fire run hot for 6 hours until the stone glowed warm to the touch. Then, he let the fire die down to coals. The stone radiated heat through the night. By morning, the cabin was still warm enough to work without a coat. The skeptic didn't visit during November. Other neighbors did. They saw the curved metal shell and asked what it was for. The medic explained the heat reflection principle, the thermal mass of the stone, the air gaps in the walls and ceiling. Most of them nodded politely and left. 2 of them laughed. One said the medic had built a fancy oven that would bake him alive. Another said the metal would rust through by spring and collapse the roof. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days straight, then climbed back to 0. The medic burned 1 load of firewood every 36 hours. His neighbors were burning 1 load every 12 hours. The helper came by on December 10th and asked to see the firebox. The medic showed him how the stone stayed warm for hours after the fire died. The helper asked if he could measure the wood consumption. The medic said yes. The skeptic returned on December 15th. He brought a thermometer, a brass instrument with mercury tube that he'd ordered from Seattle 2 years earlier. He hung it inside the medic's cabin and left it for an hour. The reading showed 58 degrees Fahrenheit inside, with no fire burning, and outside temperature at -15 degrees. The skeptic took the thermometer down and left without comment. Then, January showed up. The Tanana River froze solid on January 2nd, 2 weeks earlier than usual. The ferry stopped running. The supply route from Fairbanks closed. Families who'd planned to haul firewood from the county depot were cut off. By January 10th, 3 families had already torn down their sheds for firewood. The temperature dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit on January 15th and stayed there for 6 days. The medic's cabin used 1.5 cords of firewood from November 1st through January 20th. His nearest neighbor, a family of 4 in a similar-sized cabin, burned 6 cords in the same period. The helper kept a written log. He recorded outdoor temperature, indoor temperature, and wood consumption every 3 days. By late January, the pattern was clear. The medic's cabin stayed between 55 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit, with 1 fire per day. Neighboring cabins stayed between 45 and 55 degrees, with fires burning continuously. The crisis night came on January 24th. A storm moved in from the north, dropping the temperature to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts hit 40 miles per hour. The skeptic's cabin was half a mile downriver from the medic's claim. The skeptic's stove, a standard sheet iron box, burned through his remaining firewood by midnight. He had no shed left to tear down. He'd already burned it in December. He loaded his wife and 2 children onto a sled and hauled them through the storm to the medic's cabin. The medic opened the door at 1 in the morning. The skeptic's family was frozen through, coats crusted with ice, faces red and numb. The cabin interior was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The firebox held only coals. The medic loaded fresh wood and got the fire going. Within 30 minutes, the cabin warmed to 65 degrees. The skeptic sat on the floor with his back against the stone firebox and didn't speak for an hour. The storm lasted 3 days. 7 families came to the medic's cabin during that time. He took them all in. The cabin held 11 people at its peak, sleeping in shifts, and the firebox kept the temperature above 55 degrees the entire time. The medic burned through 2 cords of wood in those 3 days, more than he'd burned in the previous 6 weeks. But the stone mass never cooled completely. When the storm broke on January 27th, the skeptic asked to see the construction details. The medic walked him through every step. The stone foundation, the curved metal shell and the roof gap, the double wall chinking, the sawdust ceiling, the massive firebox. The skeptic took notes in a small book. He asked how much the materials had cost. The medic gave him the numbers. Metal shell, traded for medical work. Fieldstone, free from the creek. Fire brick, $40 hauled from Fairbanks. Sawdust, free from the mill. Clay and horsehair, gathered from the claim. Total cash outlay, $40 plus labor. The skeptic started building his own version in February. He used the same fieldstone foundation, the same double wall chinking, the same sawdust ceiling. He couldn't find a curved metal shell, so he built a peaked roof with a ventilated attic space, trying to capture the same air gap principle. 2 other families started similar builds before March. By the time the river thawed in April, 7 families had copied or adapted the design. The helper continued logging temperature and fuel data through March. Final numbers for the full winter. The medic's cabin used 8 cords of firewood from November through March. Average neighboring cabin of similar size used 22 cords for the same period. The difference was 14 cords. Enough firewood to heat a cabin for an additional 7 months at normal consumption rates. The skeptic published his notes in the Fairbanks newspaper in April. He wrote that the design reduced firewood consumption by 68% compared to standard cabins. He wrote that the stone firebox maintained livable interior temperatures for up to 20 hours after the fire died. He wrote that the curved metal shell reflected enough radiant heat to keep the cabin interior above freezing, even during the coldest nights without continuous fire. He included his temperature measurements and fuel logs. He ended the article with a single line: "The innovation works, and I was wrong." 7 families began construction of similar designs before spring breakup. The medic provided consultation at no charge. He walked each site, checked foundation depths, explained the stone firebox assembly sequence, and demonstrated how to seal the metal shell joints with clay and moss. He refused payment, but accepted meals and firewood deliveries as trade. The helper took on 2 apprentices that spring. He taught them the stone layering method, the firebox throat design, and the proper angle for heat reflection off the curved metal shell. By summer, 3 more families had started foundation work. The innovation spread through practical demonstration rather than promotion. The design required more initial labor than a standard cabin. Foundation work alone took 2 weeks with a full crew. Stone collection and shaping added another week. Metal shell installation required careful measurement and multiple adjustments. Total construction time averaged 6 weeks from foundation to completion, compared to 3 weeks for a standard log cabin. But the fuel savings repaid the extra labor within the first winter. The medic documented his own construction costs in a letter to his sister in Seattle. He spent $43 on metal sheeting purchased from a supply warehouse in Fairbanks. He spent $12 on iron hardware for the firebox doors and hinges. He spent $6 on clay mortar and lime. Stone, timber, and moss were gathered from the surrounding land at no cost. Labor was provided by himself and the helper in exchange for shared meals. Total documented cost, $61 for materials. A standard cabin required $30 in nails, hinges, and door hardware, but consumed an additional $400 in firewood over 5 winters. The math justified the investment. Other modifications appeared as neighbors adapted the design. One family extended the stone firebox throat by an additional 2 feet, creating even longer heat retention after the fire died. Another family added a second curved metal panel on the opposite wall, reflecting heat from both sides of the interior. A third family built a smaller version for a single-room trapper's shelter, reducing the metal shell to a quarter-circle segment. Each variation maintained the core principle. Stone mass holds heat, metal reflects it, and proper sealing keeps it inside. The river ice broke in late April. Supply barges resumed service in early May. The medic received a letter from the territorial governor's office in June, requesting plans and construction notes for potential distribution to other isolated settlements. He drafted a 4-page instruction document with measurements, material lists, and assembly diagrams. He included a warning. The design works only if the foundation extends below frost line. The firebox throat is built to exact specifications, and the metal shell is sealed completely. Shortcuts produce a structure that looks similar, but performs no better than a standard cabin. The skeptic retired from medical practice in the fall of that year. He spent his final working months training a replacement doctor and helping 3 more families complete their own thermal mass cabins. He kept his temperature journals and fuel logs through the following winter, comparing his new cabin's performance against the medic's original design. His numbers matched within 5%. He wrote a final article for the Fairbanks newspaper, recommending the design to any family serious about long-term settlement in interior Alaska. By the winter of 1879, 14 families in the Fairbanks area had built variations of the design. Wood consumption across those households dropped by an average of 65% compared to standard cabins. The innovation became common enough that new arrivals asked about the curved metal roofs before they asked about land prices. The technique spread east along the Yukon River settlements and west toward the Kuskokwim drainage. The medic continued practicing frontier medicine until 1882. He treated frostbite, set broken bones, delivered children, and made winter house calls on snowshoes. He died of pneumonia in March of that year, 3 weeks after treating a family with the same illness. He was buried in the Fairbanks cemetery under a wooden marker that listed his name, his birth year, and his profession. The marker made no mention of the cabin design. His helper maintained the cabin for 2 more years, then sold it to a mining family moving up from California. The innovation remained in use across interior Alaska through the 1890s. Families maintained the stone fireboxes, patched the metal shells, and taught the construction methods to new settlers. The design declined after 1900, When commercial coal became available through Fairbanks supply companies, and railroad construction brought cheaper heating stoves from outside. By 1920, most thermal mass cabins had been abandoned or converted to standard heating systems. The stone fireboxes remained, but the curved metal shells were often removed and sold for scrap. One original structure survived into the 1950s. A trapper family 40 miles east of Fairbanks maintained the medic's design through 3 generations. They replaced the metal shell twice, rebuilt the firebox throat once, and added modern insulation to the walls without altering the core thermal system. The cabin remained functional and occupied until 1957, when the family relocated to Anchorage for medical care. The structure was photographed once by a visiting journalist, then left to weather. No record exists of its current condition. The principle behind the design remains valid. Stone absorbs and releases heat slowly. Metal reflects radiant heat efficiently. Proper sealing prevents convective loss. Winter survival in extreme climates depends on understanding these physical relationships and building structures that exploit them. The innovation worked because it aligned human shelter with the behavior of heat in cold environments. The medic never patented the design. He never charged for consultation. He never promoted the innovation beyond answering questions from neighbors. He built the cabin to solve his own heating problem during a supply crisis, then shared the solution when others asked. The technique spread because it delivered measurable results: lower fuel consumption, stable interior temperatures, and reliable performance during the coldest nights. Practically the interior walls dry enough to prevent mold growth during spring thaw. He included temperature readings from 4 separate locations inside the cabin, proving that the design maintained consistent heat distribution, rather than creating cold zones in corners or near the floor. He included the fuel consumption comparison, showing the 14-quart difference. He concluded that the design represented a significant improvement over standard log construction for families facing fuel shortages or extended cold periods. The newspaper printed the article on page 2. Response was immediate. Within 10 days, 3 families visited the medic's cabin to examine the construction. Within 3 weeks, 5 families had begun ordering curved metal panels from the Fairbanks Metalworks. By early May, 7 families had started foundation work for their own thermal mass cabins, each adapting the design to their specific fuel sources and available materials. 2 families used sod and clay instead of stone for the thermal mass. 1 family built a larger firebox to accommodate split spruce instead of birch. Another family added a second metal shell around the existing cabin walls rather than building new. The helper documented each adaptation, recording dimensions, materials, and anticipated heating capacity. He shared the notes with anyone who asked, maintaining the medic's approach of open consultation without charge. He emphasized the importance of proper sealing around door and window frames, noting that even small gaps could reduce efficiency by 15 to 20%. He warned against oversized fireboxes, explaining that larger combustion chambers required more fuel to reach operating temperature and increased the risk of incomplete burns that wasted wood and created dangerous creosote buildup. The skeptic assisted with 2 of the new builds, supervising firebox construction and checking metal shell alignment. He insisted on temperature monitoring for each completed cabin, requiring owners to record interior and exterior readings at sunrise and sunset for the first 30 days of operation. He compiled the data into a second article for the newspaper, published in October, that confirmed consistent performance across all 7 builds. Average fuel savings ranged from 62 to 71% compared to standard cabins. Interior temperature stability remained within 8 degrees across all monitored locations. even during nights when exterior temperatures dropped below -45 degrees Fahrenheit. The design continued to spread through interior Alaska over the following winter. By March of 1877, at least 19 families had built or modified cabins using the thermal mass principle. Most used local stone and clay for the firebox. Most ordered curved metal panels from Fairbanks suppliers, though 3 families fabricated their own shells from flattened barrel stock and riveted seams. 1 family in Eagle built the firebox from river cobble instead of fieldstone, achieving similar thermal retention with smoother interior surfaces that reduced ash accumulation. The medic maintained his practice through the spring and summer of 1877. He continued making house calls, treating injuries and illnesses across a 60-mile radius of Fairbanks. He assisted with 2 difficult childbirths, set fractures from logging accidents, and managed a small outbreak of dysentery in July. He declined payment for most services, accepting food, firewood, or labor in exchange for medical care. He spent his spare time improving the cabin, adding a small covered porch to reduce snow accumulation around the door, and building a raised platform for firewood storage that kept split logs dry and accessible during heavy snow. In September, he began experiencing persistent coughing and fatigue. He attributed the symptoms to seasonal cold exposure and continued working. By October, the cough had worsened, accompanied by chest pain and difficulty breathing during physical exertion. The skeptic examined him in early November and diagnosed advanced pneumonia, likely caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp conditions during house calls. The skeptic prescribed rest, heat, and herbal treatments, warning that the infection had progressed beyond the point where recovery was certain. The medic refused to stop making house calls. In late November, a family 12 miles north of his cabin reported illness among 3 children. The medic traveled through a snowstorm to reach them, diagnosed pneumonia in 2 of the children, and stayed for 3 days to monitor their condition. He returned to his own cabin in worsening health, his symptoms now including high fever and severe respiratory distress. The helper brought the skeptic to the cabin on December 2nd. The skeptic confirmed that the pneumonia had spread to both lungs and that survival was unlikely. The medic died on December 7th, 1877, at approximately 3 in the morning. The helper was present. The skeptic arrived 2 hours later and recorded the cause of death as bilateral pneumonia complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. The medic was 41 years old. He left no written will, no family correspondence, and no personal records beyond his medical notes and the construction drawings for the cabin. The helper inherited the cabin and its contents by default, as no other claimants came forward. The funeral was held on December 10th in Fairbanks. 23 people attended, including the skeptic, the helper, and 11 families who had built cabins using the thermal mass design. The medic was buried in the town cemetery under a wooden cross marked with his name and the year of death. No memorial service was held. The gravesite received no visitors after the initial burial, and the wooden cross deteriorated within 5 years, leaving the location unmarked by the mid-1880s. The helper lived in the cabin through the winter of 1877 and 78. He continued logging temperature and fuel data, recording a total consumption of 7.5 cords for the full heating season, slightly lower than the medic's original winter due to improved sealing around the door frame and better draft control in the firebox. He maintained the cabin through the spring, then sold it in June to a mining family relocating from California. The sale price was $120, paid in gold dust. The helper used the money to purchase passage to Seattle, where he found work as a carpenter. He never returned to Alaska. The mining family occupied the cabin for 3 years, making minor modifications but preserving the core thermal mass design. They added interior partitions to create separate sleeping areas and replaced the original door with a heavier frame to improve security. They sold the cabin in 1881 to a trapping family, who maintained it through the 1880s and 90s. That family replaced the curved metal shell once, in 1893, after wind damage compromised the seal along the roofline. They rebuilt the firebox throat in 1902, using mortared brick instead of clay to improve durability. The design remained in use across interior Alaska through the turn of the century. At least 34 cabins incorporating the thermal mass principle were documented in Fairbanks area records between 1876 and 1900. Most were occupied continuously, passed between families as homesteads changed hands, or as miners and trappers relocated. The innovation became locally known, but never spread beyond the immediate region. No patents were filed. No commercial production of standardized components occurred. The design existed as shared knowledge, transmitted through direct observation and word-of-mouth instruction. The technique began to decline after 1900, as commercial heating options became available. Coal shipments through Fairbanks increased after railroad construction reached the interior. Cast iron stoves and prefabricated heating systems offered convenience and consistent performance without requiring specialized construction knowledge. Families gradually abandoned thermal mass cabins in favor of standard designs that could accommodate modern heating equipment. By 1920, fewer than 10 original thermal mass cabins remained in active use. The last documented example survived until 1957. A trapping family maintained the design through 3 generations, preserving the stone firebox and curved metal shell while adding modern insulation and weatherproofing. The cabin remained functional and occupied until the family relocated to Anchorage for medical care. The structure was abandoned in place, left to weather without maintenance. A visiting journalist photographed the cabin in 1958, noting its unusual construction, but providing no historical context. The photographs were published once in a regional magazine, then filed in a private collection. The cabin's current condition is unknown. No preservation efforts have been recorded. The physical principle behind the design remains unchanged. Thermal mass absorbs heat slowly and releases it over extended periods. Reflective surfaces redirect radiant energy toward occupied spaces. Proper sealing minimizes convective loss. The innovation succeeded because it applied these principles systematically, creating a structure that reduced fuel consumption while maintaining stable interior temperatures during extreme cold. The medic understood the physics. He built accordingly. The results validated the skeptic, continued his medical practice in Fairbanks until 1884. He maintained detailed records of winter fuel consumption across the settlement, documenting the performance gap between thermal mass cabins and standard construction. His notes included temperature measurements, wood cord counts, and maintenance observations spanning 8 winter seasons. The data showed consistent results. Cabins incorporating the thermal mass principle used between 60 and 70% less firewood than comparable structures, relying on conventional heating methods alone. He shared these findings with territorial officials during supply planning meetings in 1882. The territorial government acknowledged the potential fuel savings, but declined to mandate or subsidize thermal mass construction. Officials cited the higher initial labor cost, the specialized knowledge required for proper construction, and the limited availability of suitable stone in some locations. The design remained optional, adopted by families willing to invest the additional build time in exchange for long-term heating efficiency. The helper continued documenting winter performance data until 1886. His final recorded measurements covered 12 thermal mass cabins across the Fairbanks area, tracking fuel consumption, interior temperatures, and maintenance requirements over a 5-year period. The data confirmed the medic's original results. Average firewood consumption remained between 7 and 9 cords per winter for thermal mass cabins, compared to 20 to 24 cords for standard construction of similar size. The most efficient example used 6 cords total during the 1885 to 1886 winter, a season that included 43 consecutive days with temperatures below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The helper died in 1887. His records were transferred to the Territorial Archive in Sitka, where they remained filed under general homestead construction documentation. No subsequent analysis or publication of the data occurred. The archive relocated to Juneau in 1906, and the helper's records were consolidated with other territorial construction documents. The files survived multiple administrative reorganizations and remained accessible to researchers, but generated minimal interest. A graduate student reviewed portions of the documentation in 1934 while researching frontier heating methods, noting the fuel efficiency data but not pursuing detailed analysis. The innovation's decline accelerated after 1910. Commercial heating systems became standard in new construction throughout interior Alaska. Prefabricated stoves and coal-burning furnaces offered simpler installation, required no specialized masonry knowledge, and provided consistent performance without the labor-intensive maintenance that thermal mass systems demanded. Families building new cabins chose conventional heating almost universally. Existing thermal mass cabins remained in use, but owners rarely passed the construction knowledge to subsequent occupants when properties changed hands. The last active practitioner of the technique died in 1923. He was a stoneworker who had assisted with 7 thermal mass cabin builds between 1878 and 1902. He maintained his own thermal mass cabin until his death, then left the property to a nephew unfamiliar with the system's operation. The nephew converted the cabin to conventional heating within 2 years, removing the curved metal shell and modifying the firebox to accommodate a standard cast iron stove. The stone thermal mass remained in place, but no longer functioned as designed. By 1930, the thermal mass principle had disappeared from active construction practice in interior Alaska. The physical structures remained visible in scattered locations, recognizable by their unusual stone firebox designs and metal shell mounting points. But the operational knowledge had been lost. Settlers and miners occupying these older cabins often misunderstood the systems, operating them as conventional fireplaces and negating the thermal mass advantage. The innovation became historical curiosity rather than living practice. The final documented thermal mass cabin was photographed in 1958 by a journalist traveling through the Fairbanks region. The structure stood 40 miles east of town, abandoned but largely intact. The curved metal shell showed rust damage and several missing panels. The stone firebox remained solid, with minimal cracking in the mortar joints. The interior walls showed evidence of water damage from roof leaks, but the thermal mass construction was still recognizable. The journalist noted the unusual design in his field notes, but did not investigate its history or operational principles. The photographs were published once in a regional magazine article about abandoned homesteads, then archived in a private collection. No preservation efforts were undertaken. The cabin was located on unincorporated land with unclear ownership status. Local historical societies showed no interest in documenting or maintaining the structure. By 1965, the roof had collapsed completely. The metal shell deteriorated further, with most panels fallen or removed by salvagers. The stone firebox remained standing, but exposed to weather. The site was visited occasionally by hunters and trappers, who noted the unusual stonework, but had no context for its purpose or significance. The innovation left no institutional legacy. No building codes incorporated thermal mass principles. No construction manuals documented the technique. No professional builders specialized in the method. The knowledge existed entirely as practical experience passed between individuals. And when those individuals died or relocated, the knowledge disappeared. The physical evidence remained in scattered ruins across interior Alaska, but the operational understanding was lost. Modern off-grid builders occasionally rediscover similar principles. Thermal mass heating systems using stone, concrete, or masonry appear in contemporary sustainable construction, often presented as new innovations. The physics remain identical. Dense materials absorb and release heat slowly. Reflective surfaces redirect radiant energy. Proper sealing minimizes heat loss. These principles functioned in 1875 and function identically today. The medic understood them through direct observation and systematic testing. His innovation worked because the physics worked. The technique was forgotten because convenience replaced efficiency as the primary design criterion. The end.